Hello and most welcome to 850. I'm sitting outside and it is rather chilly today, I would say. Couldn't be more than 8 or 9 degrees. The sun gives some heat, but it's still a chilling wind coming from the east. This is the Heidegger 850 and I had to mention there's been some problems with my sleep. My snoring device haven't been working lately here. It got broken because jaw lock, I think it's called. So I'm a bit tired, but who said? I think it was Patrick Stigson who said that one should try to do things when you are very tired, because they are bound to turn out much better. Let's see here if this actually holds true. I'm gonna give it a go. I talked earlier about that being some inborn limitations, some traits that sort of narrows the perspective, and they are established already before, and they have always already been there. And this almost, what could you call it, mythological or mystical way of speaking does actually hide something most interesting, and that is that there are things that are established already by the time we are born, and we have never ever been able to point them out because they are pre-conceptual. They are not part of language either, and this is what, for instance, Heidegger called amnesis or amnesia. Already established limitations. It's an inheritance, and this inheritance is something no one, I would say, until Heidegger had even brought up to the surface, just because everything already established means that our very language is imposing, in a way, that limitation. It makes it harder for us to dwell on, to go into and actually experience. This is the reason, of course, why Heidegger went through the cumbersome process of developing this new language to, so to speak, undo the fixations and leaving the scene more open for other things to come by. And that is the start of philosophy, according to Martin Heidegger himself. You will be having a larger playground, so to speak, when the limitations are dissolved or eased up. Not as acute, not as strict, not as limiting as before. So it's an idea of doing philosophy in two moves. The first move being loosening up what has already restricted our thinking for the last 2.5 millennia, and the second one is seeing what we could do with this new freedom, what new knowledge can be gathered, and how can we start to see what we already have in a new light. This is more or less what I experienced myself very much the last couple of days here. I see that things I read digested, consumed, so to speak, begin to shine in a completely new, adventurous and fascinating light. And I all of a sudden begin to realize there are possibilities where there used to be none. And it's also a completely new play on meanings that wasn't possible before. It's not so much that I perceive something I read before or learned before in a completely new light. It is that the old understanding becomes broadened, so to speak. It becomes something more. And I really like this process. And it's similar to as Martin Heidegger describes the process of doing two things at the same time, both easing up the fundamentals that has been in place long before our births and affected us in a way that is completely limiting. It's a destroying almost of what is, as Heidegger says. It's the ontic movement that makes everything so much more so much more small. And I would say this is also the very reason for why quantum mechanics cannot be integrated in our language, in our understanding, because these preset limitations makes it impossible. A second thing that also come to my mind is the more we are in these limitations, the more we do philosophy, something that Wittgenstein and Heidegger for once would agree cannot be called philosophy or any other thing, because it's just a development of more and more limitations. This dead end, to go into that one, or be locked up in the cave. Well, once you are out of the cave, you will notice doing philosophy in this new fresh manner is absolutely different. It's more enticing, it's more welcoming. It offers so much more for the person, and the person itself becomes easier, I'd say. There is an easiness that spreads. You feel calmer, and it's utterly nice. It's utterly nice. But this also opens up, as I was supposed to say here, for quantum mechanics. That was a possibility that it had earlier been shut out. I will come back to that a little bit later here. I will still just be fairly summary of my conclusions so far at this very early stage. Still waiting for more effects. It did stop the progress when it comes to Heidegger. He didn't go beyond crossing out. And I think he manually, bodily understood much more than he could sort of pronounce or develop, making clear. He couldn't verbalize it, and he was sort of stuck in that situation, and that situation that limited him could have been opened up, as Graham Priest suggests, with paraconsistent logic. That was what he was looking for, I would say. Paraconsistence logic could have opened up his thinking there, but he couldn't reach it, and this is actually nothing you can sit in his enormous mountain hut and sort of understand by thinking. That needs external input. And I think that sort of came with his successor. So although Heidegger started the process by crossing out, it did not go further, or did not go far enough until Derrida sort of continued the quest, the mission. And it was only with Derrida you could go further. Derrida had an inherent understanding, and I don't know exactly where it came from, but I think a very educated guess would be that his extremely different upbringing, being in a culture that was already crossed out, so to speak, being born a Jew in an Arabic surrounding with a Christian French authority on top of the whole, makes for so many different measuring rods, so to speak. So you could actually, and I think that is what happened with Derrida to some extent, could actually see that there is something pre-established in Islam, Christianity, or Judaism. And he understood by the comparison. This is just me guessing. But he had an inherent unconscious understanding for that there were already always limitations set to thinking. And this is why his project is so fascinating and so stimulating, because it gives energy. It is not that old stale philosophy that only established within the limitations already established. It is rather an opening up, expansion. And that expansion is completely literal. You do feel it yourself in your whole body system when you sort of practice this method. I'll come back to that later. You feel a mental relaxation, an opening up of mind. And it's hard to describe, but I think it could be reached, can be reached, it can be explained, it can also be transferred to others. So this is a very felicitous message. So happy. I think this is the very way of relaying quantum mechanics to the population, because without this tool, that wouldn't have been possible, because I was myself stuck in the pre-limitations to a certain extent, and thus they need to be loosened up by me also for the things to become clearer. And this process isn't ghastly complicated. It looks really ghastly complicated in Rudolf Gachet's book, but as a matter of fact, the more I train it, the more I do it, the more I understand it is amazingly easy. And I think maybe that is what got me thinking here, and that was partly the inspiration for this very lecture, that this can be transponded, this can be transferred to others, but in a completely different format, of course, than that of the Rudolf Gachet. Because all of a sudden, with this book, I can do the method myself, something that Derrida never mentioned. He never verbalized the limitations that were already put in place. He goes into each and every text and make it whole again. He expands it. He makes it having depth once more. But what he does and how you can do it yourself, that is not part of his mission. for obvious reasons, I would say. But learning how to do it, it's a completely different thing. All of a sudden I can do it myself. And that's why I mention it's important that I learn it, you too. Because with this magical wand, if you call, you can do deconstruction wherever, whenever, and in any circumstance you prefer. No longer is there a need to make a choice here in between one or the other, or existence or non-existence. All of a sudden I realize they are not excluding each other. Existence does not exclude non-existence. They can both be present at the very same time, and they can both be absent at the very same time. Before this realization that was both corporal, spatial, I would say, temporal, that was nothing I could do. This makes for a unique way of entering into, an area that was impossible to reach without this knowledge. And I would say that this is comparable in some ways, well, in many ways, or absolutely comparable to how Niels Bohr was able to construct the idea of complementarity. It is impossible to do that in the fundamental limitations that was already established in the Western world. It came as an injection from the East, and only in the East is there an understanding you can have complete existence and you can have complete absence or non-existence at the very same time, with nothing being excluded, and there is no loss at all in fullness, presence, and you can still have absence, you can still have distinctions, only with the yin and yang symbol, which is in reality a device for paraconsistent logic. That lies in the very core of what is understanding in this level. Paraconsistent logic tells us that something can be doesn't mean it cannot not be. It is the very idea of exclusion that has been following all thinking in Western society in all strands of knowledge bar none, and which always is already established the very moment you are born. And without that thing, it would not be possible to think these things. This is why I pointing out especially that it would never ever be possible for Heidegger in his massive Berghof hut to come to the understanding that paraconsistent logic is a necessity to solve the problem of crossing out. That understanding can never be thought out. It can only be done. And this is also the reason why quantum mechanics is so important. Without the understanding from physics, we will never ever accept complementarity. Otherwise, complementarity would be a sort of mysticism, a myth, and it won't have that effect. So I see clearer now why quantum mechanics always has to come into the picture. It is the forcing energy that helps us get rid of the shackles of the old fundament. Because those shackles needs to be broken. Otherwise we will not be free anymore. Freedom will be lost for us, and we will be locked up in this limitations, and the further we go into the limitations, the more limiting they become. And you get frustrated in the end, and you start changing all the time, and you start realizing that you are on a very, very small edge, and you're always at the risk of falling into non-existence or existence, because that is in the very ground, and it's something that is perceivable. We actually perceive that where existence is, nothingness is not. And where nothingness is, existence is not. And I would say even this is probably true for the animals. That makes it even more clear why there is such a necessity for quantum mechanics. And that needs to be complemented, nice, round here, needs to be complemented with this understanding of the mirror, which is actually the method. So the method I'm trying to learn, taking a step by step, because it is an incredible difference to what I thought about before. It's nothing I ever would have imagined myself to experience, to be completely honest. Actually, to be completely honest, I could have succumbed or died on the way, or by old age, before I opened the book of Tane of the Mirror. It was an absolute necessity. And of course it brings about much more pleasure being able to deconstruct yourself, so to speak. Perceiving that it is possible in every situation to do deconstruction, and not having to, as I always done before, copy-paste Derrida, citing him, quoting him only. And now I can do the method myself, and I will bring this method to as many as I can. But I need to digest the method myself, consume it, make it integral with myself. That's an absolute necessity before you can go any further. And this method is both something you do and something you understand at the very same time. In this case, there's no difference made between method and understanding in a way. Doing the thing is the understanding. And the more I realize how the method works, the more I seem to understand all things I read about Derrida. They come to play and be livelier and more interesting, sort of speaking to me, and things that I didn't even know I didn't understand all of a sudden becomes clear. It's like a cloud is soothing up or disappearing. It's dissipating in front of my very eyes. And of course that is a pleasurable feeling, if there ever were any. It's just fantastic. But as I said before, of course I need more time to digest. This is completely new for me, just a couple of weeks. But one thing I can say that is, when you look into the mirror, think of this. You don't have to make a choice, which is more real, the mirror image or the thing looking into the mirror. They can both be equally real, and they can both be equally false. And it's this, the limitation is only one thing can work. And I think that is so fundamental in our thinking. But oddly enough and fantastically enough, this is something that can be opened up. And this is literally an opening up process. And you feel that you mentally had been sort of squared in somewhere. And it's also tension. Oddly enough, this plays fantastically well with the discoveries of John Appleton. And I think that also he, just like Heidegger, would have been very, very serviced by paraconsistent logic, complementarity. I will tell him, but he is also working with these two differences, the dorsal and the ventral. And they seem to be opposing, and I think most people are sort of stuck into an idea. Thank you. Most of them are stuck in an idea of that, for instance, the dorsal area, that the dorsal area is something that should relax, and that the ventral should be more tense. So it's an either-or situation. But it's not like that. It's actually a much more difficult thing. I always thought, but all of a sudden it is not that difficult. You can say it is more of a transferal of tension where there is too much to an area where there is too little, and that in itself is a flow. So I guess you see now that there is a possibility of a movement, and that movement can only be if we allow both opposing sides to be existent or non-existent at the very same time. And that goes equally nice for the posture release imagery of John Appleton as in quantum mechanics, and now into the method. I call it method still. Method of deconstruction, where you do it yourself. Allowing both sides to be alive at the very same time, and not having automatically always already having to make a choice. And yes, we mentioned many times before that we had some cumbersome thinking about the law of the excluded middle. We were talking about Aristotle, but all of a sudden this is much easier. Now it's so much easier to understand that the law of the excluded middle is not a necessity. And actually, it is a necessity to dissolve the law of the excluded middle to get this freedom. Otherwise, there will be none. There is no way for freedom in thinking, and it's restricting itself if we don't allow both sides to be real at the same time. Just give me a second here. So there is a deconstruction actually going on in my own thinking when it comes to the body, and it makes it possible for the movement to come by. There is no movement if only one side can be real at one time. It's sort of the same movement as you find in the yin and yang symbol. It is moving, look at it. It's going clockwise and it is energized. It's driven by the oppositions. And you can see clear and understand clear that they need to be opposed and at the same time co-working for there to be a possibility of this movement, this very movement. It's the matter of coexisting oppositions. That is the masterpiece of Derrida. He sort of brought me into this sphere of thinking. I was already interested in quantum mechanics to some degree, but that really sprang to action when I read the books of Arkady Plotnitsky. And this goes to show that Jacques Derrida is the only thinker, I would say, whose work lends itself to be used in quantum mechanics. No other thinker has that capability. So you can take Quine, you can take Searle, you can take Richard Rorty, you name it. None of them will be able to adhere and enforce and let it be a possibility to have these opposing sides working at the very same time. It's an absolute necessity. There will be no movement at all otherwise. Although that book is very cumbersome, it is something I understand I needed to change as well. The subject who reads the book is not something that is separated or isolated. You need to change yourself. And of course, in a very shallow way, that is the participation of the observer. But in a much deeper way, it's something much more. It means that in order to understand more, you need to develop yourself. So it's the subject and the object at the very same time. And of course, now we can also shine a new light on this passivity we mentioned so many times. The observer and the theoreme of the Greek, the theater-like feature, and they are a necessity. They are unavoidable without the method or the image of the mirror, the gestalt of the mirror. But once the mirror becomes clear in all its different shapes, I will speak more about that some other time, you develop the power to change yourself so you can understand quantum mechanics. And you can let the cat be live and dead at the very same time. And you will not find any more problems with that. But you need to sort of change, develop yourself. That's an absolute necessity. Otherwise, that will not happen. And another thing that has become more clear here now, it's the thing with Gödel. And I was thinking about this Hofstadter book, Hofstadter's, that is so become so great the last couple of decades. Nobody could believe that it would be this enormous development in its popularity. But his book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, this GEB book, which in a marvelous way shows the impossibility first. You read the book, impossibility for a self to exist, how everything gets into the Parmenidean vision, everything gets shut out, locked out of vision, no longer accessible, no longer part of what we can understand. Everything in the Parmenidean vision is absolutely filled up. Everything is existence. And if everything is existence, there is no room for a self. There is no reflection possible. It cannot be the other side. And if you only take the other side like the idealist, you will lose the world. So it is a dilemma without a doubt. And I think until now, for me, that dilemma had been really acutely real, something unavoidable, something that I could not avoid. But now, all of a sudden, I see it's not as much as a problem. It's still a problem for me. But I think that changes through time, because imagine yourself dissolving things that been gathering up for at least 2,500 years. That will not happen in a second. It will take massive training, understanding, and I think the dorsal ventral comes in here. As long as I take in space, I feel it's easier to understand this. Yeah, it's definitely a necessity that in this very instance to take in space. A second here. Sorry. I prepared a little delight here and an idea of first take on trying to explain this mirror thing in a completely different way. Well, that's the good thing. The good news is we don't have to use the mirror. Once I understand it myself or understood it myself, you can transfer it to any other situation you want, and that's the very good thing. That's actually an enormous gift from Rudolf Gachet. It's the book goes much further than the book itself. You are learning a skill, and this is a sort of book, once you understood it, you don't have to keep it either. Because once you learn the method, it would take some time, but you don't need to keep it. I think that could be also a very big difference to other books where you want to keep them and you want to go back and there's a certain quotation or cite that you want to do. That's not a necessity when it comes to the book of The Tale of the Mirror. It makes it completely different to any other book I experienced so far. It's it's a bit like the thing that I always wished for. Yeah, to be honest, I always wished for it to be possible to understand Ludwig Wittgenstein. And as it's written in the book Philosophical Investigation, you can leave the book and you do not have to open it again. And that never happened with that book. And I don't know if it really happened for anyone who read it. I don't think there is sufficient things in the book to make a full understanding. But I do think it will still be helpful, and Wittgenstein is one of those books you do want to keep. And not only for quotation or citation, but you can go back and reread either parts or the whole thing. So the promise of philosophical investigation wasn't Jaså, tycker jag. wasn't completely it didn't measure up to the promise in the book. But that actually happened with Tame of the Mirror. This is what it did. And I realize when I understand this, I can transfer it. My first transfer, let's cut to the chase. And this suggested by Kalle Lundahl here, supposed to visit the Vincent van Gogh exhibition and his shoes. And is this masterpiece from 1886, and it's consisting of 2 shoes, look like this. I don't know if this is going to be a visual here or the remaining sun is going to block it out. Yes. Yes. The history of the book, in 86, Van Gogh visited Paris flea market and came across a pair of worn out shoes. He bought them and he brought them back to his atelier in the city's Montmartre districts. Nobody knows why he bought them, but it could actually be the very reasonable fact that he needed a pair of shoes. And he did try to wear them, and he could not make them fit his feet. They did not fit, and instead that lad, he used them as a prop for painting. And these very shoes later became the most celebrated shoes in art history, without a doubt. A pair of worn out shoes became the most celebrated shoes in art history, and that is amazing in itself. So, how did the mirror come in here? Well, think about the shoes. You have 2 shoes. One is left and one is right. They are always different. Are they mirroring each other? No, they don't mirror each other, but there is a left and there is a right. And this is rather interesting because left and right has similarities to negations. And although up and down and east and west and north and south do not exist in the universe, oddly enough, left and right do exist. And I think most people, if they were to take a gander, what would exist, they would say up and down. But that does not exist in the universe. But left and right do exist. And here all of a sudden we have 2 things that are opposing each other, but they are both necessary to have a pair of shoes. I think that is very similar to what Gachet shows in his book, that we need the oppositions and we need them to be existing at the very same time. And that is the makeup of the universe. So where do we find this left and right? Well, you find it all over the place. You find it in molecules who are turned either left or right, and they are left or they are right. One good example is lactic acid in our bodies. They follow a specific system where left turn lactic acid is in a relationship with right turn lactic acid. One is produced by the T2 muscles, for instance, when they're getting exhausted and they consume sugar without the existence of air, and you get this sourness in the muscles. The other one is the T1. And T1 muscles are the ones who not consume sugar, instead consume fat, and they do that in a circumstance that is contain air. So you see there is also a relationship between T1 and T2. And I until recently thought, well, just let's get rid of T2. These are the muscles that are making me tired. These are the muscles that doesn't help my posture. It makes it harder for me to have a good posture. And then I can be left with only the T1. But it doesn't work that way. They are in a way complementary. They are at the very same time needed. And the same goes with the shoes. They will never ever be the same from the perspective of the shoes themselves. They won't even be mirror image. But at the same time, because the universe is constructed to its very detail of these opposing forces, you will need both pairs, both shoes, both the left and the right one. Left and the right is a system that works all over the universe, so to speak. And what does Van Gogh do with the wooden sabots? Well, oddly enough, he gives them a clear, unworn shape and a surface like a smooth still life, and the smoothness that the other objects has around the shoes. These objects are not present, but they are mirroring the shoes, so to speak. They are participating in a relationship. And although this sounds really odd, everything that is around is affecting in a way. And this is something I learned when I was painting myself. And I think this is one of the things that Jacques Derrida wrote about the shoes, because he actually took a gander at them as well. Here's a little snippet from that one. Derrida writes, there is another line, another system of detaching traits. This is a work qua picture in its frame. The frame makes a work of supplementary désœuvrement. It cuts, but it also sews back together by an invisible lace which pierces the canvas as the pointure pierces the paper. You can say the paint you put on the paper is piercing the paper. It makes absolute sense in this circumstance. And you sew it back into its very own environment, and from that very second the shoes are no longer useful because they are detached from naked feet. And from the subject of reattachment, the owner, the usual holder, the one that wears them and whom they bear, it is also because they are painted within the limits of a picture, but limits that have to be thought in laces. Hors d'oeuvre, in the oeuvre of hors d'oeuvre as oeuvre, the laces go through the eyelets, which also goes in pairs, and pass on to the invisible side. And when they come back from it, do they emerge from the other side of the leather or on the other side of the canvas? The prick of their iron point through the metal edges eyelets pierces the leather and the canvas simultaneously. And I think that's a very good description of what happened to the shoes, because when you look at the painting, And you can see the painting here as a mirror image of what used to be out there when Van Gogh painted the shoes. You could say at the very same time the thread, the shoelace, goes into the metal eyelet. It also goes through the canvas. So see this as the one looking into the mirror and the mirror image that comes back are doing things that are complementary. They are left and right at the very same time. And at any given moment you can always separate them and say that is left and that is right. But at the very same time as well, they participate in a system where both left is functioning and also right. And this is happening at the very same time without a stop really. So this is the working procedure. Well, next meeting I say thank you very much. It's getting a little bit chilly. Sorry about that rather summery version of the shoes, but I think they actually lend themselves to make an understanding that left and right can be absolutely different, having nothing to do with each other, not at all, and at the same time participating in the very same thing. And I think for a chemist that would be obvious, but he would never ever transfer that to his own reality, where he always already makes a separation. But you see here, we perpetually find new models. There is no limitation in the understanding of new models. So I take in the mirror and I put them into the shoes. And I say thank you very much, and I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye.